Hello there, and welcome to Whispervase USA. This is Kevin, and tonight we'll journey back in time and hear the real diary of a knight. This is one of history's most vivid and personal accounts of the medieval crusades written by John Vaillant, a French nobleman who accompanied King Louis on the Seventh Crusade to Egypt and the Holy Land between 1248 and 1254. Unlike many medieval chronicles written by monks from second-hand accounts, Zen was actually there fighting in battles, suffering from disease, enduring capture, writing decades later as an old man. He provides an unvarnished look at medieval military life, complete with graphic descriptions, devastating effects, the brutal realities of siege warfare, and the complex relationships between Christians and Muslims. His account is especially valuable because he knew King Louis personally and offers intimate portraits of royal decision-making, the tensions between French nobles, the crushing financial costs of medieval warfare. This is history told by someone who lived it, making it one of our most authentic windows into the 13th century world. And it goes like this. In the name of Almighty God, I, John, Lord of Jeanville, Steward of Champaga, am writing down what I witnessed during the 6 years I spent alongside King Louis on his holy pilgrimage to the east. After we returned home in 1241, the king held a magnificent court at Saumur in Anjou. I was there, and I can testify it was the most splendid gathering I ever witnessed. Music seated beside the king was the Count of Poitiers, whom Louis had recently kned on St. John's Day. In front of the king's table sat the King of Navarre, dressed in a coat and cloak of rich silk fabric, adorned with a golden belt and clasp. King Louis himself wore a coat of sky blue satin and a cotton cap that frankly didn't suit him very well. Throughout the hall, an enormous number of knights were feasting, more than I could count. Many said they had never seen so many gold-embroidered surcoats and garments. There must have been 3,000 knights present. But by God's will, a terrible illness struck the king, bringing him so close to death that one of his nurses declared him dead and was about to pull the sheet over his face. Another nurse on the opposite side of the bed stopped her. When the king heard the two women arguing, our Lord worked within him and restored his health, for he had been unable to speak. As soon as he could, he asked them to bring him the cross, and they did. When his mother, the queen, heard that his speech had returned, her joy was boundless. But when she learned he had taken the Crusader's vow, she grieved as if he lay dead before her eyes. Music after the king took the cross. All three of his brothers followed suit along with many others. So at Easter in the year of grace 1248, I summoned my vassals and followers to Zouanville. We feasted and celebrated all week, Monday, Tuesday, and wed. On Friday, I addressed them. I'm going overseas, I said, and I don't know if I'll return. Come forward. If I have wronged any of you, I will make it right and settle any grievances you have against me or my servants. Music, I resolved all matters concerning my estate's affairs. Then I set out with 9 other knights, myself making 10. Soon the wind filled our sails and carried us beyond sight of land. We saw nothing but water and sky, and each day the wind took us farther from the land where we were born. If God had not been constantly at my side, I could never have endured those 6 long years I spent in the Holy Land. When we reached Cyprus, the king was already there. I, who had an annual income of less than 1,000 pounds, had taken on the burden of supporting 9 other knights on this overseas venture. When I arrived in Cyprus after paying for my ship, I had only 120 left. Some of my knights sent word that unless I could find more money, they would abandon me. But God, who never failed me, provided. The king summoned me, retained me in his service, and put 800 pounds into my treasury, giving me more money than I really needed. When March arrived, by the king's command, he and the nobles and other pilgrims loaded their ships with wine and provisions. When everything was properly arranged, the king ordered his nobles to follow him in their ships straight to Egypt. Music on Saturday. The king set sail, and all the other vessels likewise. A magnificent sight to behold. The entire sea, as far as the eye could see, seemed covered with canvas from the ship's sails. There were reportedly 1,800 vessels, both large and small. On the Thursday after Pentecost, the king arrived at Damietta and found all the sultan's forces on the beach. Impressive been to look at, for the sultan's banners were golden and glittered in the sun. The noise they made with their drums and horns was terrifying to hear. While disembarking his men, a knight belonging to Lord R of Brienne named Plan tried to get down from the large ship into a small boat, but the boat drifted away and he fell into the sea and drowned. Returning to my ship, I put into my small boat a squire I had named Lord Hugh of Venner, along with two brave young knights, Lord Vi and Lord William of Dameron. These two were bitter enemies, and no one could make peace between them. In Moria, they had actually grabbed each other by the hair, but I made them put aside their hatred and kiss each other, swearing by all that was holy, that we wouldn't set foot on land while they remained enemies. Music, we headed for shore and came alongside the king's large ship. His men began shouting at me because I was getting ahead of them, but I paid no attention and landed us facing a large battalion of Turks, about 6,000 mounted men. As soon as they saw us land, they spurred their horses toward us. We planted our shields in the sandpoint first, and our lances the same way. When the Turks saw they couldn't advance without being impaled, they turned and fled. The Saracens sent word 3 times to the Sultan by carrier pigeon that the king had landed, but received no reply. The Sultan was ill. They concluded he must be dead and abandoned at Damietta. The king sent a knight ahead to scout, and when he confirmed this, the king and all the army's priests sang, giving thanks for the Lord's favor and delivering Damietta into our hands. Music, the Turks made a serious error leaving Damietta without destroying the bridge of boats, which would have caused us great difficulty. So the king and all of us mounted our horses and rode to camp. It happened that Lord Walter of Atrahad armed himself fully in his tent and mounted charged out alone against the Turks. Before he reached them, he fell and his stallion ran into the enemy ranks. Most of the Saracens rolled mares, which attracted the horse, for Cyrus came upon Lord Walter. As he lay on the ground and struck him, the constable of France rescued him, some of the king's sergeants, and carried him back. He couldn't speak. Several surgeons attended him, and judging he wasn't in mortal danger, bled him in both arms. Music, but late that evening, Lord Albert of Nari and I visited him and found that he was dead. When the king was told, he replied that he would regret losing 1,000 men like him since they would disobey orders he had done every night. Saracens would sneak into the camp and kill people they found sleeping. By Lord of Sign's sentry was killed this way. Music, the Sultan paid a golden coin for every Christian head. While the king was there, the great king of the Tartars sent messengers offering to help him conquer the Holy Land and liberate Jerusalem from the Saracens. The king sent messengers in reply who were gone 2 years before returning. How they were received, I shall tell you as they told it to me. It's a strange tale, but I won't relate it now. Music, when the Count of Poet arrived, the king summoned the nobles to decide whether to march to Alexandria or Cairo. Most of the nobles agreed to go to Alexandria, but the king's brother opposed this, saying that if you want to kill a snake, you must crush its head first, urging the king to march to Cairo. The king ignored his nobles' advice and followed his brother. One night, While we were keeping watch over the towers, the Turks brought up a siege engine, filled it with Greek fire, and hurled it at us. Lord Walter of Cool, who was with me, said, "We're in the greatest danger we've ever faced. If they set fire to our shelters, we are lost and burned. But if we abandon our posts, we're disgraced. Only God can save us." He advised that every time they threw fire, we should kneel and pray. The first shot passed between the two towers and landed right in front of us. Our firefighters extinguished it. The Saras, unable to aim accurately, shot to height so their fire fell back on themselves. The Greek fire looked like a dragon flying through the air, casting such bright light that you could see all over the camp as if it were daylight. That night they hurled Greek fire at us 3 times. The next day, their siege engines found their target and 2 of our towers burned. The king of Sicily wanted to rush into the flames to put them out, but my knights and I praised God. If we had been on watch that night, we would have perished. Later, my knights and I attacked some Turks who were loading their baggage. After we fought through the Saras camp, we found about 6,000 Turks had abandoned their quarters. As we returned, the Turks charged us. My horse, feeling the weight, fell to his knees, and I went over his head. But I got up with my shield and my arm and sword and hand. Lord Aaron of Severe, God rested his soul, came to me and said we should retreat to a ruined house and wait for the king. As we went, a great horde of Turks attacked us, knocked me down, and seized my shield. Lord Herrera of Severi led me along until we reached the walls of the ruined house where the Turks attacked us from all sides. My knights fought bravely and were praised by all the army's champions. Lord Hugh of Scots was wounded in the face. Lord Frederick of Loop was wounded between the shoulders, and Lord Herrera or Very nearly had his nose chopped off. I prayed to St. James for help. Lord R said, "Sir, I'll get you help from the Count of Anu, whom we could see in the fields. He went out, but died of his wound." He did though reach the Count of Anu, and begged him to help us. The Count agreed, and several sergeants spurred ahead. When the sirs saw them coming, they left us alone. I stood there on foot among my wounded knights until the king arrived with his whole battalion, trumpets sounding and drums beating. Never did I see him so magnificently equipped. He towered head and shoulders above his followers, wearing a gilded helmet with a German sword in hand. There was no archery, only fighting with clubs and swords. Turks and our men all mixed together. One of my squires, who had fled with my banner but returned, brought me my pony. I mounted and rode up to the king, taking my place at his side. People say that day would have been the end of us all if the king hadn't been there in person. In this battle, many fought well, but then fled disgracefully over the little bridge. We couldn't persuade a single one to stand with us. I could name them, but I'll refrain since they're dead. Music after these battles, our real troubles began. After 9 days, the bodies of our dead rose to the water surface, floating down to the bridge that connected the 2 camps. The king hired 100 laborers who worked for a week removing them. The sirs' bodies were thrown to the other side of the bridge to drift downstream. Christians were buried in trenches. People searched for their friends among the dead, but I never heard of anyone being recognized. We ate no fish all during Lent, only eels that had fed on the bodies. Because of this and the unhealthy climate, we were struck with camp sickness. Our flesh withered, our skin became spotted, and swollen flesh grew on our gums. No one escaped this sickness except through death, and when the nose began to bleed, that was when death was near. 2 weeks later, the Turks, intending to starve us, dragged their ships overland to the river, causing famine. None of our people dared come from Damietta to bring supplies. By Easter, an ox cost 80 pounds, a sheep 30, a pig 30 pounds, an egg 12, and the barrel of wine 1 pound. The sickness worsened, and so much infected flesh grew on people's guns that barbers had to cut it away so they could eat. Music because of my wounds. Camp sickness seized me in my mouth and legs along with fever and severe congestion. My priest suffering the same illness fainted during Mass, but I held him in my arms and made him finish. He never said Mass again. The King's Council and the Sultan's Council agreed to terms. Music Demida would be returned to the Sultan, and the Sultan would restore Jerusalem to the king. But seeing that we would die if we stayed longer, the king ordered everyone ready for departure. At nightfall, we went aboard, and as we sailed down the river, the king was captured on land while we were captured in the water. The mounted Saracens shot arrows at us. My people dressed me in armor, and when my sailors tried to run us ashore out of fear, I drew my sword and threatened them. Soon, 4 of the Sultan's ships approached, and I called my men to decide whether to surrender to those on land or to the ships. We agreed on the ships as they would keep us together. One of my sailors said we should all let ourselves be killed and go to heaven, but we didn't listen to him. Seeing we would be taken, music I threw my cash box, jewels, and relics into the river. The sailor told me to claim I was the king's cousin or they'd kill us. As the first ship closed in, the Saracens jumped aboard. One tried to catch me, but one protected me, calling me the king's cousin. In my fear and sickness, I began to shake uncontrollably. I asked for water, but it poured from my nose due to a growth in my throat. My followers wept. The sirs asked why. They replied, I had a tumor and no hope. But one of the knights said he would give me something to drink that would cure me into days, and he did. On the following Sunday, the emir made us and the other prisoners land on the riverbank. While dragging my priest, Lord John, from the ship, he fainted and died and was thrown in the river. I protested that this violated the teachings of Saladin, who said you shouldn't kill a man who has shared your bread and salt. They replied, these were good men for nothing, being disabled by disease. On the Thursday before Ascension Day, we came to where the pavilion was pitched and the king was brought ashore. The Sultan had arranged for Damietta to be delivered to him. The king was to be released, but the emirs, whom the Sultan had dismissed, conspired together. A wise old Sar said, you see the shame and disgrace the Sultan has brought upon us. Let us have our revenge. The emir hurled Greek fire at the Sultan, setting his tower ablaze. The Sultan fled and was pursued and died. 30 men came to our ship with swords and axes. I asked Lord Baldwin, who knew Arabic, what they were saying. He said, they have come to end us. Many confessed their sins to a monk of the Trinity Order, but I could think of none to confess. I crossed myself and knelt at the feet of a man with a Danish axe. They made us leave where we were and shut us up in the ship's hold, packed so tightly that my feet touched the face of Count Brittany and his touched mine. Eventually, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, aged 80, obtained safe passage from the Saracens and came to the king to assist him. After terms were agreed and sworn, we were to be freed on Ascension Day, but they kept us until sunset with nothing to eat while the emirs argued. One proposed killing the king and the rich men so their young children would pose no future threat. Another, a Moroccan, opposed him, saying if we killed the king after the Sultan, it would be said the Egyptians were the most treacherous people on earth. Our deaths were nearly agreed upon, and an emir signaled to the ships. We gave ourselves up for lost, but as God pleased. It was decided at sunset that we would be freed. They insisted we eat before leaving, lest it disgrace the emirs for us to leave hungry. The food was cheese fritters cooked in the sun and hard-boiled eggs painted in various colors. We were put ashore and went to meet the king, followed by 20,000 sirs with swords. While staying in the king summoned his brothers and nobles and asked their advice. His mother wanted him to return to France, but he feared for his kingdom's safety. He gave them a week to decide. The papal legati told me he didn't see how the king could possibly remain, and urged me to share his ship. I said I couldn't, having lost everything. I answered that I thought the king should stay. Leet asked how the king could hold the field with so few men. I replied, well, sir, it's sad. The king has yet to spend any of his own money, only that of the clergy. Let him spend his own money and recruit knights from abroad. Afterward, I sat beside the king at dinner, but he didn't speak a word to me, which was unlike him. Later, he placed his hands on my head and asked how I could dare advise him to stay against the council of all the great men of France. I told them, so help me God. Yes, sir. He asked if I would stay, and I said, yes, Sam. The announcement of the king's decision to stay was made on the feast of St. John days later. The king complained he had no knights in his service. I told him it was because everyone set such a high price wanting to go home. In the king's room, he asked me how much I was asking. I said 2,000 pounds until Easter for myself and my knights. He calculated it and agreed, retaining me in his service. While the king was fortifying Caesarea, the messengers from Tartarus returned. They had traveled a full year through land subject to the Tartarus, passing cities laid waste and piles of bones. They told how the Tartarus had originated in a sandy plain where nothing good grew, said to be where Gog and Magog were confined. Who would come at the end of the world? The Tartar king sent a letter. Peace is good. We cannot obtain peace, except through us. Send us gold and silver each year, or we will destroy you as we have others. The king regretted never sending messengers to them. We found that the king himself had overseen the burial of the Christian dead, carrying bodies to the graves without covering his nose while others did. He set workmen to build walls and towers and marked out quarters for everyone. I built a hut for myself and my knights, but the Count of Anjou, who was clever, made a machine to throw things into it and break our jugs and glasses. He also released a young she-bear among my chickens, and killing a dozen. I managed my affairs as follows. After the king's brothers left, I had two chaplain, one saying mass at daybreak, the other waiting until my knights and squires had risen. My bed was positioned so no one could enter my tent without seeing me to avoid scandal about women. When St. Ray feast approached, I stocked up on pork, sheep, flour, and wine for winter. As prices rose in winter because the sea was rough, I bought about 100 barrels of wine, keeping the best for myself and my knights, diluting the servants' wine with water. Once a knight was caught in a brothel. He was given a choice: be led through camp stripped to his shirt or forfeit his horse and armor. He left them to the king and quit the camp. I begged the king to grant the horse to a poor gentleman. The king refused, saying it was still worth 80 to 100 pounds. Merchants told us the king of Tartarus had taken Baghdad, capturing the caliph and putting him in an iron cage, starving him and then tempting him with his jewels, saying, if you had spent some of this, it would have been your defense. When King Louis left the city of Sidon, which he had fortified, the patriarch and nobles told him his stay could no longer benefit the kingdom and advised he returned to France. After Easter, the king and queen boarded their ship and departed. On St. Mark's Day, the king told me he was born that day, and I replied he could say he was born again, escaping a land of danger on the feast of St. Bartholomew. Louis the Good King died 1270, and his bones were buried at St. Denis in France. Yet there's something more I want to tell about our holy king to his honor. In a dream, I thought I saw him in front of my chapel at Swanv. joyous and light-hearted. I was happy to see him at my castle. Music, I said. Sir, when you leave, I'll lodge you in a house of mine at Shell. And he answered, laughing, by my faith, Sir Juan, I'm in no hurry to leave this place. I want everyone to know that I have written down here a great part of the deeds of this our holy king seen and heard by me personally. I mention this so those who hear this book may firmly believe what it says, which I have truly seen and heard. This was written in the year of grace 1309 in the month of October.